There is a moment most people recognize, not a dramatic one, just a quiet moment when you realize you've been holding your breath for a very long time. You've been watching, anticipating, tracking what might go wrong, trying to stay one step ahead of something that hasn't even arrived yet. And then at some point, sometimes out of sheer exhaustion, sometimes without fully meaning to, you let go. And something shifts, not because the situation changed, not because the problem disappeared, but because something in you stopped fighting so hard. This is what we're going to look at today, not as a teaching, not as advice, just as something worth noticing. 7 observations, 7 simple things that become visible when we stop trying so hard to hold everything together. Observation 1. Fear grows in the direction you face it. There's something interesting about fear. The more attention you give it, the more real it becomes. Not because it's powerful on its own, but because fear has a way of reshaping how you see everything around it. It's like a lens. And when you look through it long enough, the distortion starts to feel like the truth. Here's what happens in ordinary life. Someone is afraid of losing their job. That fear is quiet at first, just a background hum, but slowly it changes how they move. They second-guess their decisions. They hesitate in meetings. They pull back a little. And that pulling back, that tension, becomes visible to others. The fear begins to shape the outcome it was trying to prevent. The same pattern appears in relationships. Someone afraid of being left holds on more tightly than usual. And that tightness, that need for reassurance, gradually pushes the other person toward the distance they were afraid of. There's no cruelty in this. It's just how fear operates when left unexamined. An old observation about the mind goes like this. The mind doesn't judge what you plant inside it. Whether it's fear or calm, it treats both as instructions and quietly helps them grow. You are not powerless in this, but the shift doesn't come from fighting fear. It comes from noticing it. From pausing long enough to ask, is this thought building something real or is it feeding something imagined? That pause is where things begin to change, not dramatically, just quietly. The way a room feels different when someone opens a window. Observation 2. Something happens when you stop gripping. We tend to associate strength with control, with managing outcomes, with staying on top of things, and on the surface that makes sense. Control feels like safety. It feels like competence, but look a little more closely and you'll notice something odd. The more tightly you try to control something, the more anxious you tend to feel. Not less, more. Because control, when it becomes compulsive, is almost always driven by fear underneath. Fear that things won't work out. Fear that without constant supervision, everything will unravel. And living from that place is exhausting. There's a simple image that captures this. Imagine holding water in your open palm. As long as your hand is relaxed, the water stays. The moment you try to close your fingers and hold it tighter, it slips through. Surrender, in the way we're describing it here, isn't passivity. It isn't carelessness. It isn't giving up. It's something more like this, doing what you honestly can do and then releasing the need to manage everything that comes after. There's a quiet confidence in that, not arrogance, not indifference. Just a kind of steadiness that says, I've done my part, I trust what comes next. And in that steadiness, something interesting tends to happen. Energy comes back, thinking becomes clearer. Possibilities that were invisible before, because you were too braced for problems to see them, start to appear. It isn't magic. It's just what happens when the noise of constant control gets a little quieter. Observation 3. Anxiety lives in the future. The present is different. Here is something that becomes noticeable when you watch the mind carefully. Anxiety doesn't live here, not in this moment. It lives slightly ahead of you, in the imagined conversation, in the projected outcome, in the constructed version of what might happen next week, next month, next year. You're sitting still, but your mind is running, spinning scenarios, building worst cases. racing toward a version of the future that doesn't exist yet. And while it's doing that, while you're caught inside those projections, you're not here, not fully. The moment you're actually living in passes mostly unnoticed, because your attention is somewhere it hasn't arrived yet. What becomes visible when you return to the present, even briefly, is something quite simple. Here, in this actual moment, nothing catastrophic is happening. You are breathing. You are sitting somewhere. The sounds around you are ordinary, and that ordinariness, when you actually land in it, has a kind of steadiness to it. The word mindfulness gets used a lot, but stripped of its formal context, it points to something quite basic, returning to where you actually are. And every time you return, even for a moment, the future loosens its grip just a little. Because there's nothing chasing you here, not in this breath, not in this second. The mind may keep running, that's what minds do, but you don't have to follow it every time it goes. Observation 4. Most of what we carry never arrives. There's a pattern worth noticing. Think back over the last few months. How many things did you worry about that never actually happened? Not most of them, almost all of them. The conversation you dreaded turned out to be fine. The situation you braced for resolved in a way you didn't expect. The worst case you spent 3 nights quietly rehearsing in your head never came through the door at all. The mind is a remarkably creative storyteller. Given any gap of uncertainty, it fills the space with narrative, and those narratives are vivid. They feel urgent and real. The problem isn't that the mind does this. That's just what it does. The problem is when we start treating the stories as if they were facts, when we react to the imagined version of events as if it were already happening, when we carry emotional weight for problems that exist only in thought. Here's a simple question worth sitting with. Is this something that is happening right now, or is this a thought about something that might happen later? That question doesn't always bring relief, but it does create a small distance between you and the story, and in that distance, something shifts. The weight doesn't disappear entirely, but it becomes lighter, less certain. More obviously, what it actually is, a thought, just a thought, not a prediction, not a fact, just the mind doing what it always does, filling the unknown with something it can work with. What's real when you come back to it is often much quieter than what the mind was preparing you for. Observation 5. Control and trust pull in opposite directions. There's a tension worth acknowledging here. You cannot fully grip the wheel and also trust the road, not because one is right and one is wrong, but because they require opposite things from you. Control says, unless I manage this carefully, it will go wrong. Trust says, I can act with care and still not need to hold every outcome. When you try to micromanage the details of your life, every conversation, every result, every way a situation might unfold, you're making a small but constant bet that things won't work out unless you personally oversee them. And that bet costs something. It costs energy, attention, presence. It keeps a part of you always slightly braced, slightly watchful, never quite able to rest. Faith, not in a religious sense, just in the basic sense, is the willingness to act and then release, to water the seed without yanking at the root to see if it's growing, to do what's honest and careful and then let the unfolding be what it is. This isn't naive. Careful action still matters. Thoughtful decisions still matter. The difference is what happens after. Whether you can do your part and then sit quietly without needing to manage everything that comes next. That's where something opens, not because you've stopped caring, but because you've stopped needing every outcome to match your plan exactly. And in that opening, that small release, something like peace becomes available, not as a reward, just as what's naturally present when the constant effort to control settles down a little. Observation 6. Worry shrinks. Letting go opens. Worry is quiet at first. It starts as reasonable caution, a few careful thoughts, some extra planning, a mental note to stay alert. But over time, without noticing, it begins to narrow things. You stop reaching for things that feel too uncertain. You pull back from conversations where you might be misunderstood. You protect yourself in ways that slowly become their own kind of cage. It doesn't feel like fear. It feels like being sensible, but look at what's actually happening. The goals get smaller, the voice gets quieter, the world subtly gets a little less spacious. Worry doesn't protect, it contracts. And the strange thing is, letting go, which feels like vulnerability, actually does the opposite. It opens things. When you release the grip on what might go wrong, you have more room for what might go right, more room for curiosity, for trying something unexpected, for showing up without the full suit of armor. Think of it like this. You're standing in a river. The more you try to cup the water, the faster it moves through your fingers. But if you relax, if you float, the river carries you. That's not surrender as defeat. That's surrender as release. The grip loosening, the current doing what currents do. And in that relaxation, something becomes available that the gripping was covering up. A kind of steadiness, a kind of space, where there's room for creativity, room for connection, room for something new to arrive. Observation 7. Life moves more easily when we stop blocking it. Here is something that gets overlooked in all the noise about taking control of your life. Life already has a kind of rhythm, not a mystical one, not a secret plan, just the ordinary way things unfold when they're not being pushed or forced or frantically managed. And a lot of the difficulty we experience, the resistance, the exhaustion, the constant sense of swimming against something, comes not from the situations themselves, but from the way we try to interfere with them. Think about the times you forced something, pushed a conversation that wasn't ready, rushed a decision under the pressure of a future that hadn't arrived, gripped a relationship so tightly that it couldn't breathe, and then think about the times you didn't, when you took a breath, when you let something be what it was without immediately trying to fix or change it. How did those moments tend to resolve? The water doesn't force its way around the rock. It moves around it naturally, not because it's passive, but because it's not fighting the shape of things. We've been taught quite thoroughly that the opposite of control is chaos. That if we relax our grip, everything will fall apart. But that's worth questioning. Has the constant control ever really delivered the peace it promised? Or has it mostly delivered a version of safety that still feels restless underneath? The interference we create, the constant checking, the replaying, the managing of things that haven't happened, doesn't protect us from chaos. It just keeps us very, very busy. And while we're busy, we often miss the thing that was actually trying to happen. So what does it look like to hold things a little more lightly? Not to stop caring, not to abandon responsibility, but to act thoughtfully, sincerely, and then release the need to control every detail of what follows. You plant the seed, you water it, but you don't pull on it every morning to check whether it's grown overnight. There's something in that, something quiet. You hold the butterfly in an open palm. Closed fingers would crush it. But an open hand, that gives it room to land and room to leave and maybe room to return. The same principle shows up in goals, in relationships, in plans. They need space to breathe. And the tighter we hold them, the less room they have. This isn't passivity. It takes a certain kind of courage to stop gripping what you're afraid of losing, to do what's honest, to say what's true, to show up with care, and then to let the outcome be what it is without needing it to match your plan exactly. That's when something shifts, not always dramatically, usually just quietly. The weight on the shoulders gets a little lighter, the breathing gets a little deeper, and something that was tightly wound begins slowly to relax. And you start to realize that a lot of what you were afraid wouldn't happen without your constant intervention was never something you were meant to force in the first place. At the root of our need to control is almost always fear. Fear of failing, fear of losing, fear of not being enough. But here's something worth sitting with. Life doesn't ask for perfection. It just asks you to show up, to do what's genuinely yours to do, and to trust that the rest doesn't entirely depend on you. There's one area in your life right now, you probably know what it is, where you might be holding on more tightly than you need to. A conversation you keep replaying. A decision you're forcing before it's ready. A plan you're gripping so hard it started to feel like weight instead of direction. What would it look like to hold that a little differently? Not out of carelessness, not out of resignation, just out of something quieter, something more like trust, because the moment the grip loosens even slightly, space appears. And in that space, things begin to move, not because you made them move, but because you stopped blocking them. That's the whole thing, really. We're not here to conquer the river, we're in it. And the difference between exhaustion and ease often isn't about effort at all. It's about whether we're fighting the current or learning slowly to move with it. So if there's one thing that becomes visible across all 7 of these observations, it's this. Most of the difficulty isn't in the situations. It's in the resistance to them. In the constant managing, the bracing, the imagining, the tightening, not because we're doing something wrong, but because we've learned to live in a kind of permanent preparation for what might go wrong. And that preparation has a cost. It keeps us slightly ahead of ourselves at all times, slightly out of reach of the moment we're actually in. What becomes visible when the preparation quiets down, even briefly, is something quite ordinary. Just this, just here. Just the simple fact of being present in an unremarkable moment that doesn't need you to fix anything. In seeing, only seeing. In hearing, only hearing. In breathing, just this breath. Nothing waiting to be solved. Nothing requiring your grip. Just the ordinary texture of being alive, which is, it turns out, already complete.